coming. Thanks to you, those of you here on Zoom. As is the Center for the Study of the Middle East annual duty, we are welcoming graduate students who will be presenting at the Middle East Studies Association conference this coming later this week. We have three presenters today. EDUARDO ACARON-PADILLA, who will be joining us in a little bit, Alex SHEPARD, and on Zoom, AZADEH. We're going to start today with AZADEH, and I will ask that you give us the title of your paper as well. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. My paper is about the people of the book and Shiʻism, the image of al-Kitāb in Nahj al-Balāghat. Share my screen with you. The treatment of al-Kitāb, the people of the book, by Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Shi'i Imam, as portrayed in the Nahj al-Balāghat, the peak of eloquence, shows a remarkable record of protecting minority sides. In Islamic terminology, the Ahlul Kitab refers to the followers of the scripture possessing religions that predate the Quran, most often Christians and Jews, and according to some Shia scholars, Zoroastrians. Their treatment in Islamic societies in general, even under Shia government, has varied dramatically over time and has raised considerable controversy. Numerous works have been written on the Ahlul Kitab and their rights within a Shia government. However, only a few have focused on Imam Ali's approach and manner toward them. Nahj al-Balāghat, which is the most famous collection of Imam Ali's sermons and letters, is one of the sources illustrating his legacy of tolerance towards other religions. Focusing on the Nahj al-Balāghat, this paper analyzes Imam Ali's approach to the Ahlul Kitab and examines his conduct, orders, and advice, especially to his officers regarding the treatment of the Ahlul Kitab living under Islamic governments. Jizya and Kharaj are two technical terms in the system of Muslim taxation. Jizya refers to the tax that must be paid by Ahlul Dhimma, the indigenous Jewish, Christians, and Zoroastrian populations living in Islamic territories were permitted either to convert to Islam or to maintain their previous religious affiliations, but paying a special tribute, usually in the form of a poll tax or head tax known as the jizya. Historically, the jizya tax has been understood in Islam as a fee for protection provided by the Muslim ruler to non-Muslims, with the exemption from military service, permission to perform their rituals in a Muslim state, and as material proof of the submission to the Muslim state and its laws. Kharaj is a type of individual Islamic tax on agricultural land, and its produce developed under Islamic law that was sometimes used interchangeably with jizya tax levied on non-Muslims. In early Islam, Kharaj was synonymous with jizya, which later emerged as a prehead paid by the dhimmi. There are many statements in Nahj al-Balāghat which are generally concerned with human rights and address all people, regardless of their religion. Some of them exclusively deal with Ahlul Kitab, on which I focus in this research. My presentation will highlight a few of them. When Imam Ali appointed Malik Ashtar as the governor of Egypt and the surrounding areas, he wrote to him a letter containing the most significant advice about the collection of the Kharaj, fighting against the enemies, seeking the good of the people, and making the cities prosperous. In this letter, Imam Ali asked Malik to be kind to everyone. He categorized people into two groups, those who were his brother because of following the same religion, and those who were like him in terms of creation. The second group had different religions, meaning they were Ahlul Kitab. He says, Malik, you must create in your mind kindness, passion, and love for your subjects. Do not behave towards them as if you are a voracious beast. Malik, that amongst your subjects, There are two kinds of people. Those who have the same religion as you have, they are brothers to you, and those who have religions other than that of yours, they are human beings like you. In the letter to Malik, Imam Ali also urged him to forgive those who misbehave intentionally or unintentionally. He said, men of either category suffer from the same weaknesses and disabilities that human beings are inclined to. They commit sins, indulge in vices, either intentionally or foolishly, and unintentionally without realizing the enormity of their deeds. Let your mercy and compassion come to the rescue and help in the same way and to the same extent that you expect Allah to show mercy and forgiveness to you. Imam Ali's reference to all people in general implies that he didn't restrict forgiveness to any particular people. Imam Ali in that letter to Malik also reminded him that the people he ruled over were divided into 8 classes, and the well-being of each class dependent on the welfare of the other classes in the society. These 8 classes were the soldiers, secretaries, judges, officers, Muslims, and non-Muslims who paid jizya and kharaj, artisans, traders, and poor people. Imam Ali described how these social classes depended on each other. He firmly believed that the army could be maintained only by kharaj. He said, the upkeep and maintenance of an army depend on the kharaj collected by the state. It's clear from Imam Ali's point of view that al-Kitāb who paid kharaj had a vital role and was considered as the maintenance of the army in Islamic government. He also asked Malik to take care of all matters related to kharaj and kharaj payers. He said, look after kharaj affairs so that those engaged in it remain prosperous, because in their prosperity lies the prosperity of all others. The others cannot prosper without them, because all people are dependent on kharaj and its payers. Furthermore, Imam Ali reminded Malik that these 8 classes of society had rights and duties stated in the Quran and Hadith. He said, and every one of these classes has a share in livelihood in the name of Allah, and every one of these classes has the right upon the ruler of the state that at least minimum necessities for its well-being and contented living are provided. Imam Ali also commanded Malik to reduce the amount of kharaj and relieve the kharaj payers' stress if they complained about anything. Because in Imam Ali's perspective, kharaj payers were a country's true wealth, and any investment in them, even in the form of reduction of taxes, would be returned to the state in the condition of prosperity of its cities and the improvement of the whole country. Imam Ali in the letter to Malik also commanded him to fulfill his commitment faithfully. The word dhimma, pledge, in this letter referred to the dhimmi contract between Muslims and Ahlul Kitab. He said, if you conclude an uqdah, agreement, between yourself and your enemy, or enter into a pledge with him, then fulfill your agreement and his discharge your pledge faithfully. Place yourself as a shield against whatever you have pledged, because among the obligations of Allah, there's nothing on which people are more strongly united despite the difference of their ideas and variation of their views than respect for fulfilling pledges. He also commanded Malik to avoid exploiting the ambiguous words in the contract. He said, do not change the interpretation of wage words after the conclusion and confirmation of the agreement. He also urged Malik not to cancel or repudiate the agreements he made, even with their enemies. In Imam Ali's opinion, the property and honor of Ahlul Kitab as respected as the property and dignity of Muslims. That's why he was deeply moved when he heard of Muawiyah's army invading storerooms and their aggression against one Muslim woman and one Christian woman while removing their jewelry. After that, he delivered a speech and blamed the audience of failing to stand up for others in this incident. He said, if any Muslim dies of grief after all this, he's not to be blamed. Rather, there's justification for him before me. Zoroastrian villagers and farmers who lived in Fars under the Dhimmi contract wrote a letter of complaint to Imam Ali about the ruler's harshness. To respond, Imam Ali wrote a letter to them. I deliberated over their complaint and found that if, on account of their paganism, they don't deserve any favorable treatment or extra privilege, they do not deserve to be treated cruelly and harshly either. We govern them. They have made certain agreements with us, and we are obliged to respect and honor the terms of those agreements. Therefore, be kind to them in the future, tolerate them, and give them due respect. Imam Ali wrote a letter to Kharaj collectors and gave them some advice. He asked them to treat Kharaj payers with equality and justice. He said, think over their wishes with patience and kindness, because you are the treasure of the subject, representative of the people, and the officer on behalf of Imamis. Behave yourself justly with the people and act with endurance regarding their needs. Do not deprive anyone of his needs and do not prevent him from securing his requirements. Following some advice to Kharaj collectors, Imam Ali also said to them, in the collection of Kharaj, do not sell their winter and summer clothing, their slaves or such of their animals as service to them. Imam Ali also warned Kharaj collectors not to punish Kharaj payers because of money. He said, do not whip anyone for the sake of 1 dirham. Imam Ali also asked Kharaj collectors to avoid touching Muslims or Dhimmi's properties if they didn't have anything to pay as Kharaj. According to Imam Ali, those who like Jesus forsake the world and its sadistic pleasures are fortunate. In summary, the statement in Nahj al-Balāghat that deal with al-Kitāb can be categorized into 6 groups. The first group is Imam Ali's commands or advice to the local governors on how to treat non-Muslims and the people of the book. In this statement, Imam Ali asked the governors to behave Kitāb kindly, justly, and moderately, to forgive their mistakes. The second group consists of is a statement about the importance of Kharaj payers, including Muslims and Dhimmis, and their role in Islamic society. According to Imam Ali, Kharaj payers are the tools of a country, the pillars of the army, and the provider of welfare and prosperity for all the people, in a way that all the people in Islamic society are dependent on them. The third group consists of his statement about the right of Kharaj payers. From his point of view, Kharaj payers have a right to expect the ruler to provide the minimum needs for their well-being and happiness. The governments also had to relieve Kharaj payers' distress. In addition to being patient with their wishes and needs, they must treat them equally and fairly. The fourth group is his commands or advice to the officers in charge of collecting Kharaj and Jizya. According to Imam Ali's statement, Kharaj collectors are not allowed to force Kharaj payers to forsake their necessities or are not allowed to touch their properties or whip them in case they have nothing to pay as Kharaj. The fifth group consists of Imam Ali's commands to the governors concerning keeping oath and promises made in contracts or agreements, including dhimma. According to Imam Ali, the rulers cannot break their promise, deceive signatories in their pledge, take advantage of ambiguous words in the agreements, and repudiate a deal with any justification. The sixth group is various statements indicating Imam Ali's respect for the prophets of other religion and their followers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, AZADEH. Are we going to do questions now, or are we going to?
I think we should probably do everyone's presentations and do questions at the end, just to make sure we can all have time to present.
Great. Then next up is Alex Shepard.
Well, thank you everyone for attending this lecture, and especially thank you to Dr. Carl Pearson and for organizing and hosting and Center for the Study of the Middle East for hosting this wonderful dry run. And thank you to my colleagues, and thank you to the Middle East Studies Association for accepting this panel. And I'm really looking forward to traveling to Denver in a few days to present on this topic. Now, my paper is about the Jesus in Usul al-Kafi, the primary Shia book of Hadith, and how Jesus is viewed, the character of Jesus is utilized by al-Kulaini, the author of this Hadith collection, to specifically defend the doctrines of Shia Islam and the polemical contexts, both in terms of an apologetic response to Christian criticisms of Islam, as well as a polemical sectarian device to be used against Sunnis. Now, just as a brief background, as I'm sure everyone is at least here listening is familiar with, Usul al-Kafi, the primary Shiite work of Hadith, is a collection of narrations reported for both the Prophet Muhammad as well as the 12 Imams, 12 chosen successors of the Prophet Muhammad. And just in a very brief nutshell, the defining characteristic of 12 Shiite Islam is the belief that the 12 Imams, 12 successors of the Prophet Muhammad, together with the Prophet Muhammad himself and his daughter Fatima, were the first beings created by God. They are supernaturally endowed beings, and God created the universe specifically for their habitation. And all the messages of all the previous prophets were subordinate to God's mission of creating a world for the 12 Imams. Now, Usul al-Kafi comments on a wide number of topics, historical, legal, and theological. The period in which Usul al-Kafi was compiled was a very productive time in the 2nd century of the Hijra year, which saw the beginnings of what we can consider the Islamic Golden Age. It's really when there was a large dawn of Islamic scholarship, because for several reasons, is that the overthrow of the Umayyad dynasty and consequently the popularization of paper and the spread of literacy really witnessed an explosion of books and writings. And given that under the Umayyad period in the first centuries of Islam, we don't know, it's very ambiguous as to what really the earliest Muslims truly believed in. But with the dawn of the Abbasid period, it makes it very clear that there were a wide variety of various sects and various theological approaches, and the Muslims of that time period had to deal and grapple with issues that didn't really have much of a Quranic basis to them. And these various Muslim sects were forced to contend with each other, and as will be seen, were forced to contend with criticisms brought by Christians and other religious groups. Now, the 12 Shiite community, of which al-Kulaini was a member and one of its most important scholars, at this time, 12 Shiites were a minority within a minority. For Shiites as a whole, were a minority in the Muslim world, and 12 Shiites were a minority when compared to other Shiite groups, such as the Zaydis and the Qassemites. Now, there's really two issues here, two very important issues for which the character of Jesus is utilized by al-Kulaini, which reflect on this time period of extensive exchange and dialogue between Muslims and Christians and between Shiites and Sunnis. Now, the first to preface this is, and just to show to emphasize the Shiite-ness of Jesus in Usul al-Kafi is that to a certain extent, Jesus in Usul al-Kafi is portrayed by al-Kulaini in roughly the same way the Quran describes Jesus, that being as a human being who was born from the Virgin Mary, who taught his followers to worship only one God, and based on the most widely accepted interpretation of one particular verse, Jesus is alleged to have escaped crucifixion and in references to his second coming. And so there's multiple hadiths which extend on this, which praise Jesus as one of the few spiritual beings who do not have a father, and emphasize his worldly mission and speak of his second coming. But there is one hadith which I would like to share, which specifically emphasizes how the missions of Jesus, as well as all the other prophets, came to support and preach the doctrine of the Imamate. Now, to quote this hadith correctly, quote, "He has established for you, the family of Muhammad, a form of religion which is of the commands to Noah, and we are commanded to whatever Noah was commanded. It is the matters that we have revealed to you, Muhammad, and the commands of Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus to follow. We are the heirs of the commissioned messengers. He has explained it so that you, the family of Muhammad, would be steadfast and united, all united group in your religion." Now, this hopefully can be seen here by this one hadith emphasizes how al-Kulaini is portraying Jesus as preaching not just Islam, but Shia Islam. Now, to turn the attention back to what I mentioned before about this turbulent time period of when you saw a dawn of not just Islamic scholarship, you also saw an explosion of apologetic and polemic literature from Middle Eastern Christian communities during the rise of the Abbasid period for several reasons. Number one is that the Abbasid dynasty did away with an older Umayyad practice of trying to restrict conversion of Islam to Arabs only. The initial rise of the Abbasid dynasty overturned a lot of the racism and basically apartheid system that the Umayyads had put in place. And there were many attempts to convert Christians over to Islam. Largely, Muslim missionaries would emphasize the character of Jesus in the Quran and emphasize that Muhammad was the rightful successor to Jesus. Now, many Christian theologians wrote voluminous treatises firing back at these allegations brought forth by Muslim apologists. Namely, Christians in their arguments stressed the miraculous nature of Jesus. They stressed the miracles of the New Testament, and they generally compared the character of Jesus with that of the Prophet Muhammad. And their basic argument went, well, Jesus performed miracles in the New Testament, even the Quran says Jesus performed miracles, but even your Prophet Muhammad does not bring a single miracle. All it has is this rhetorical statement of the Prophet Muhammad having the Quran as a linguistic miracle. What kind of evidence is that? What kind of proof is that? Furthermore, Christians said, well, when you contrast the character of Jesus with Muhammad, we find one's far more virtuous than the other. When we look at the reasons people accept Christianity, they accept it because they know it's true, whereas people accept Islam or Judaism or Zoroastrianism based on promises for worldly gain. Clearly, Islam cannot be a divine religion. Only Christianity is the divine religion. Now, many Muslim scholars wrote responses to this, numerous issues, and to focus on the subject at hand, on al-Kulaini and Usul al-Kafi, one can clearly see these hadiths where the imams speak of Jesus as a way of responding to this very argument. Namely, there are multiple hadiths where someone, even sometimes a Christian, asks an imam about proofs which were given to the prophets to convince the masses, and why every prophet had the different missions and had different miracles. And the responses from the imams in Usul al-Kafi always generally follows this an argument where they say that in every population where God was sending a prophet to convince them of Islam, God always granted them with a sign people could understand and appreciate. And the imams say that in the time of Moses, supernatural feats and wonders was the accomplishment of excellence, and that was convincing people of Moses in ancient Egypt, which is why God granted Moses powers to turn a staff into a snake. That's why he granted him the power to split the Red Sea. All the miracles which were attributed to Moses is because that's what the Egyptians would understand. They said in Jesus' time period, medicine and healing was the standard of excellence during that time period. So therefore, God gave Jesus miracles attributed to medicine, because this is what the Hebrews in the 1st century AD would have appreciated and would have recognized as a sign of God. Furthermore, they said in 7th century Arabia, during this time period, poetry and literary excellence and rhetorical gifts was considered the par excellence for that time period. And the only thing which would have convinced an Arab, a Bedouin, or Quraysh in Mecca in the 600 AD, in the 600s, was a linguistic miracle. So this is why God blessed the Prophet Muhammad with the Quran, specifically because that was the standard of excellence in that time period. So it's only rational that God would grant miracles to prophets to convince the people on a way they can understand. And now, how am I doing on time?
Yeah.
And now just to emphasize and now just one last, and now just to comment on this one last instance to talk about the exchange between Christianity and Islam. There's one interesting hadith. It's very, very lengthy hadith, and I can't read all of it. But in this hadith, a Christian actually goes to an imam and tells the imam about a dream he had and speaks of him seeing Jesus and Mary and many other holy symbols in Christianity. And the imam interprets them all through an Islamic lens. And also what's very particularly interesting about this hadith is that the imam says that Friday is the holiest day in our religion because this is the day that Mary gave birth to Jesus. And upon hearing this message, the Christian promptly rejects Christianity and embraces Islam, and specifically embraces Shia Islam, saying, I declare there's no God but God. I declare the Prophet Muhammad is messenger of God. I declare you are the vice-Lord of God. Now to turn our attention, the time I have remaining, I have about 5 minutes remaining. So I'm going to now turn my attention to the other thing I mentioned, which is polemics specifically against Sunni Islam. Now, of course, the Quran of itself is very vague on the notions of leadership. It doesn't really mention who should rightfully have succeeded the Prophet Muhammad. It doesn't really mention the ideal state for a form of government. So virtually all Islamic legal theories on statecraft and on succession were all had to be improvised later. Now, with the dawn of the scholastic period, when you really have Khulaini and Babuya, and not to mention, of course, Sunni and Ibadi theologians who began writing treatises on Islamic notions of leadership, that's when we see arguments, of course, about the nature of the succession to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, is the Shiite view of history is the Imam Ali was the rightful successor. However, the Prophet Muhammad, together with daughter Fatima, were both killed and poisoned in an illegitimate coup d'etat orchestrated by darkness incarnate al-Kitāb and his henchmen, and then Imam Ali and those who succeeded him are the only rightful leaders. And of course, Sunnis wrote voluminous, responses to this and emphasized the rightful successor of Abu Bakr and emphasized all the merits of succession that Abu Bakr inherited. And among them, a very common argument was advanced by Sunnis in their criticisms of Shiites and their emphasis why Abu Bakr and consequently Umar and Uthman were the justified successors to the Prophet Muhammad was the issue of age. Their argument was, well, Abu Bakr was far older than Imam Ali. Imam Ali was barely 30 years old. So how can you possibly say that Abu Bakr was not the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad? And this was a very common argument which is advanced by numerous critics of Shia Islam, figures such as Ibn Hanbal, Ibn Taymiyyah, wrote voluminous treatises emphasizing this notion. And not only that, but also emphasizing the young age of many of the imams, including the 12th imam, who assumed the imamate at the age of children. Now, in fact, I think the lion's share of references to Jesus, Usul al-Kafi, specifically emphasize Jesus speaking from the cradle when in responses to Sunnis. There are voluminous hadiths in Usul al-Kafi where an imam is approached by a Sunni who says, well, how can you be the leader of the world? Or how could Imam Ali have succeeded the Prophet Muhammad at his young age? Clearly, that's not, God wouldn't do that, give power to someone who is of such a tender age. The imam says, well, if we look at the Quran, we see Jesus was speaking directly from the cradle, and clearly Jesus was given authority over everyone during his time period. And they even say that even though Jesus and John were contemporaries, even though they're both prophets of God. God even made John subordinate to Jesus, and made Jesus at the age of 3 years old, having power over his mother Mary and John. So therefore, God doesn't obviously care about age. He's going to give his authority, his authority to Jesus, and that is one of the most common. And they say that, well, just as obedience to Jesus at the age of being an infant was obligatory for the believers in that time period, obedience to the Imam, regardless of their age, in our time and age, is a requirement of God. And so if you do not believe in the Imamate, you obviously do not believe in Islam. Now, on that note, I do believe I've hit my 15-minute mark. It's probably, is it? Oh, yes, 15 minutes on the dot. So on that note, I'm going to conclude saying that the portrayal of Jesus in Hatifi was utilized for two very important reasons. Number one was the right response to defend Islam from criticism of Christians. Number two, and more importantly, it was written specifically to defend Shia Islam from the criticisms brought by Sunnis. And al-Kulaini can help us understand the very formative and turbulent and sectarian time period that was the 2nd century of the Hijra year, the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age. And on that note, I will thank you all again for attending, and thank you, Carl, for hosting this panel. Thank you very much, and I don't see Eduardo yet.
No, thanks, Alex. No, our third speaker has not yet arrived, so I think we should take the
I agree.
opportunity to open the floor to discussion for both you and AZADEH. I'll go second if somebody else wants to start, or I can start.
Since you're already speaking, please.
Okay, so AZADEH, I wanted to ask you about a question about the use of the term rights.
Right.
So there obviously is a question about whether or not what rights are in the pre-modern era. So, one argument is that rights are an invention of Enlightenment Europeans. And this notion of, in particular, universal rights is something foreign to Islam. So that's one part of the question is what does that term mean, and is that traditional understanding of the history of rights wrong? And then the other question about rights is rights only function if they're enforceable, right? So if your taxpayers have rights not to be abused by the tax collectors, how does that get enforced? Who protects the taxpayers from the tax collectors?
Okay, I didn't get your first question, but I go for the second question and answer the second question, then please repeat the first one for me. For the second question, actually, because the tax collectors were the officers who were appointed by the rulers of the Islamic governments, they were these representatives. And they were appointed to collect tax from taxpayers. So in that case, I assuming that the rulers of the Islamic community or society is the one who is was responsible for it, and that person was the protector of taxpayers or Ahl al-Dhimma.
Okay, great. So the first question is about what does the term rights mean in the context of early Islam? So are rights something that are conferred on the basis of Enlightenment notions of rights are that they are something that attaches to a human being by the fact that they're a human being, right? So they're universal human rights. The rights you're talking about attached to a particular segment of the population, right? Only those, the peoples of the book. So I'm just curious about what the term means. Like, what is a right in the context of early Islamic legal theory? And presumably it doesn't attach to a human being just because they're a human being. Does that make sense?
Oh, are you asking about the terms used for the people of the book, or the terms used for different kinds of tags, or the terms for human rights? Which of them?
The term for rights. The terms for rights.
حقوق. The terms that they used for actually rights is حق, and the plural form is حقوق in early Islam.
And what does that signify in terms of legal? How does that attach to a person legally? So if you have a right, can you argue for it in court?
Yes, because they had an agreement or contract that they signed it. The agreement was called dhimma. So based on those agreements, those people who were under the contract, they were called ahlul dhimma. So they could complain, and they could write their complaint to the government or the ruler of the, or the governor of, or the ruler of the Islamic society, and they complained if they had any.
Great,
So
thank
yes,
you.
they could sue. You're welcome.
As a message from Eduardo, he's on his way.
Oh, okay.
Hamid, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like, to her response. I don't know if it's okay to share thoughts.
Please.
Yeah, the Quran also addresses many issues and rights that human beings have as a whole. And, you know, starting with the most basic, for example, it talks about do not take life, which God has made sacred, except through the term that she mentioned. So even life, which is the most precious of rights that we have, the right to life is also protected. And it's irrespective of what category a person falls under. And then other rights to property and other, so those are kind of laid out in different parts of the Quran. It's not neatly put into one little section, but it's spread out throughout. So it is addressed in many different contexts of different categories of people as well.
And the argument that, and if I can kind of on that too, it's interesting. A lot of older scholars, I think Bernard Lewis very famously made the argument that private rights don't exist in Islamic legal framework, because the difference between Islamic legality and Western legality is Western legality recognizes rights, Islamic legality recognizes obligation and duty. And that's why you have the class of civilizations. But you know, going on with AZADEH, you know, Hamid saying is that that's not really, you know, true. Without the fact that if something looks like a right, or is you call it a right, it's right. And so I think, so obviously Islam does have a similar, I guess, deontological ethics that, you know, Colin would say that, you know, there's things as far as absolutely morally right and wrong. One of them is making it innocent.
And those are God-given rights, if you will. So when God's authority transcends all else. So if that right that's basically the strongest right that a person can have within the legal court. If something's ordained by God, then that right transcends other or trumps other aspects of the legal aspect.
And because, like, so even in Islamic doctrine, even someone like Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac killer, is going to get their justice on the day of judgment because they spilled innocent blood, even though they were never caught.
AZADEH, do you see the question from Sayyid Amir in the chat?
Yes, can I answer?
Yes, please.
Sure. He's asking, I wanted to ask if AZADEH has discussed the authenticity of Nahj al-Balāgha in her paper. No, I didn't, because it's not my, actually, it was not my goal or my aim to discuss it. Although some of the sermons and letters in Nahj al-Balāgha are questionable, but because particularly human rights and the rights of the people of the book and Ahlul Dhimma and the topics about Kharaj and Kharaj payers were relevant mostly to the letter 53, letter to Malik Ashtar, and also letter 19, those letters were among the authentics one, I'm sure about it. But no, if you're asking that if I talked about the authenticity in Nahj al-Balāgha in general, no, I didn't.
Other questions, comments?
I mean,
Yeah, I have a Michael, actually.
Michael, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I had a question for you, actually. Are we going in order, or does it make a difference?
Doesn't make a difference.
Okay. So you mentioned the author of that book or perspective, and he kind of addressed the Sunni perspective from an age argument. That's not really a relevant argument. I was curious, did he address other issues, like, for example, the fact that Ali himself had actually then agreed to follow Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman?
Oh, yes, he does. Yes, he does. I mean, I gave a presentation. Well, I've written a lot about this, a lot in other details. And a couple meses ago, I gave a very detailed, presentation about Shiite criticisms of Sunni Islam. And specifically that argument, though, the argument you get in the argument which al-Khalidi makes, it becomes the standard for Shiite scholars later, is that, well, just because he gave his allegiance, it doesn't mean he actually gave his allegiance. In the sense they say that, well, when the arguments which are brought is commonly invoked, they say, well, Jesus gave counsel to the Pharisees, but didn't actually acknowledge their authority. Yusuf gave his, he followed the commands of Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh was a tyrant, and the Prophet Muhammad gave his counsel to the Quraysh. Even though the Quraysh's authority were legitimate and they were idol worshippers. So they say that Imam Ali's public pronouncements, this was really just him not wanting to cause ascension.
Compromising, basically.
Yeah, it was a compromise. It was and often they say that another argument we find is like, well, the Quran says don't kill yourself, and the Prophet, and so any attempt by Imam Ali to overturn them would have resulted in suicide. Basically, and they say that when the Prophet Muhammad was in Makkah preaching his mission, he never advocated for uprising against the legitimate authority there, because that would have inserted suicide. And so Imam Ali, during the caliphates of Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, was like the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca when he was first preaching his criticisms. But that's the gist of the argument. But then that's the tons of Hadith on that issue too.
Gotcha. And then the second part of it, I guess the other aspect that I don't know if you addressed it is like, so the Quran mentions about breaking into sects, and it talks very negatively about that. So in multiple places in the Quran, and I can pull a few verses.
No, obviously, I'm well aware of all the various verses of how they break into sects. But there are
address that in his book as well.
I mean, the arguments they use is that they, various verses with Hizbullah, the party of God, which is also in the Quran, there rise a Hizbullah, a party of believers who are successful. Our Shiites will often emphasize, emphasize that verse. And in terms of breaking into sects, there kind of the argument is, well, we didn't break off into a sect. Sunnis broke off into a sect. They say that what we believe in is that it was preached by the Prophet Muhammad, and we're just following what the Prophet Muhammad taught. So when Sunnis give their allegiance to Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and when Sunnis got the Umayyads, and when Sunnis create all these other kind of objectionable things, these horrible things like praying like this, or any other things which they think are objectionable, they say that we didn't. They basically said, well, you started.
So the position is the small minority is the main followers, and then the other 90%, 80% is they're the ones who broke off.
Exactly.
Okay.
I found it interesting for the Christian who converted to Islam, because he found that Friday was the day Jesus was born. And people pray on Friday is a big day for Muslims. That was a very interesting.
I think it was Hadith was an interesting.
Okay, so we'll return to more discussion, but we've been graced by Eduardo's presence. So Eduardo ACARON-PADILLA, could you introduce your title? And I'm going to run the slides for Eduardo, so just say next slide when you're ready, and I will share the screen.
Right. I would like to preface this by saying that this is very much a project that is at the beginning of its inception, and I've sort of begun my research on it. And so this is an exploratory paper. My paper is reimagining Timur, the poetics of representation and divine kingship in Abdullah Hatifi's Timur-Name and Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine the Great. In 803 or 1401, the Arab historian and philosopher Ibn Khaldun met with the Central Asian conqueror and military commander Amir Timur in Damascus. In a series of meetings, which he documents in an autobiographical section of the Kitāb al-Ibar, in a letter to the ruler of the Maghreb, Ibn Khaldun mentions that many people during this time attributed Tamerlane or Timur supernatural powers and charisma. He says, quote, Timur is one of the greatest and mightiest of kings. Some attribute him knowledge, others attribute him, others consider him a Shiite because they note his preference for the members of the Ahl al-Bayt. Still others attribute to him the employment of magic and sorcery. But in all this, there is nothing but room. It is simply that he is highly intelligent and very perspicacious. He is one favored by Allah and the power of Allah. And the power is Allah's, and he grants it to whoever he chooses. Despite Ibn Khaldun's dismissal of the myth of Timur, the rumors of Timur's astronomical and supernatural charisma endured long after his death. The imagination and reimagination of the legend of Timur took on new roles, and it was used for legitimizing later Timurid rulers to illustrate political and philosophical ideas, and it was also creative inspiration for poets, painters, and performers alike. Timur's biography was reimagined both by the Timurids and by the Europeans in the centuries after his death. Two of these depictions of Timur's life were widely influential as works of literature, and also became important in allegorizing relationships between language, the state, and the divine. Despite writing a century apart and 4,033 miles apart, and never knowing of each other's existence, Abdullah Hatifi and Christopher Marlowe were both interested in writing about Timur's life. Both of these takes on Timur's life take from institutionalized forms of education, collection, and conquest to create portraits of Timur. This reimagining of Timur's life and persona was marginally related to the details of his biography, and were based, and in the case of Hatifi's depiction, it was based on both a series of books titled Safar-Name, or books of victories, the earliest of which was written by Nizamuddin Shami in 1404, and later on by Sharafuddin Ali Yazdi. All of these projects were associated with a movement of intellectual networks in Iran and Central Asia, which has been described by the historian Ilkin Ebrim Bimbash. On the other hand, numerous scholars have tried to ascertain the nature of Marlowe's sources for the play and what historical sources he might have access to. One of the most important one of these is Pedro Mejia's collection of miscellaneous lessons, Silva de Varia Lección, and much of the, as well as another work that underscores the world as a kind of theater, which is Abraham Ortelius' orbicular theater of the world, which is present in the cartography of the play. These texts are all texts that assemble knowledge and are useful sources in the depiction of a world or a picture that is present in theatrical performance. In theatrical performance as well as painting. And so there is also an issue in these works on the conjunction of the cosmos and language. And so we can skip that slide. I think we can go.
Hold on. I'm going to try that again. There we go. Is that it?
Yeah, so I think we can skip this one and this one and this one. We can go towards, I think we can go towards the translations because that would be sort of the.
Right there?
Yes.
Okay.
So one of the translations is that from amongst Adam's,
Doesn't let it work. There?
from amongst Adam's children, two lords of the auspicious conjunction, Sahib al-Kiran, conquered the world from coast to coast, or from end to end. Timur Khan and Alexander of Philip, one the moon of Turan, one the son of Rus. So when Nizami swept the mine of poetry, he pricked many a ruby to describe Alexander. So he's putting his own project along in conversation with Nizami, which is also a project of collection. And he is also creating this he is sort of equalizing Alexander with Timur. And the theoretical principle behind Hatifi's book of Timur is in many ways reflects the ideas of its predecessor, the historical chronicle titled Book of Victories, Zafarnameh by Sharaf ad-Din Ali Yazdi. In the introduction to the text, Hatifi's Timurnameh shows us the textual and theoretical assemblage that is part of this retelling of the life of Timur, both through through his own retelling of the works of Nizami. He begins responding to a verse from Nizami's Iskandarnameh, where he actually says that Alexander is the Sahib al-Quran, thus referencing a common philosophical idea between both. This idea is that of astrological determinism, and the conjunction here refers to the conjunction of the planets of Jupiter and Saturn. Timur was born at a time of the conjunction of two superior planets, Saturn and Jupiter, and his fortune was determined by the combined power of both. And so these ideas had a lot in common with sort of a letrist view of the world, which Dimbash refers to as a holistic philosophical approach that has its roots in ancient Pythagoreanism and late antique Neoplatonism. But it later assumed a plethora of philosophical and religious views, including the monistic Sufism of Ibn Arabi, amongst others. And so this passage also suggests the idea that Timur's power bridges the gap between this life and the afterlife. And for Yazdi, as well as Hatifi, only Alexander and Timur had been placed in this position. The mine of poetry, Khan Sukhun, becomes the place where the language to describe such a power becomes possible for someone like Nizami and Hatifi. This conception of the power of language as something that can describe somebody that bridges the gap between the worlds and the cosmic forces mirrors the conceptions of language and letters from the 12th century philosopher Ibn Arabi, where each letter corresponds to God's words regarding our creation. His conception of language emphasizes that the letters, each of them represents an aspect of creation. Words become the actualization of a reality, an actualization that is conceived through the relationship between gods, humans, and the cosmos. And also each letter has a bodily and spiritual movement and a association with the celestial spheres. So we can move to the next one.
Or not.
Yeah, I think this is something from Ibn Arabi we can skip. Yes, so at the beginning, or when at first, the magic working Ferdowsi, Sahar Sauce, Sahar Sauce embroidered poetry with the Shahnameh. The oceans of meanings was like a shell, and the shells were filled with royal pearls. And so here Hatifi invites us to think of his own project through the eyes of another project of assemblage, which is the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. The Shahnameh collected the stories and histories of the broader Iranian world and put them together in a poem that depicts Iran's relationships with this broader world. Hatifi's project, similarly, is a depiction, is an imagining of Timur's life and conquest throughout different parts of the world. The book begins in Central Asia with the birth of Timur, continues to Balkh, where he defeats Amir Hussein, and continues on to Iran, India, the Middle East, Anatolia, and ends in China. This collection of a world in writing is understood as the creation of a world through rhetorical language, a world that is in conversation with the real world, the realms of universal knowledge, and the worlds of other texts. And ultimately, in Timur's death, we again see the role of poetic language in mediating the spiritual world and the earthly world through language. The narrator is capable of seeing the soul of Timur when a poet collects it in the narrative. And so this is one. We skip to the next one. This scene allows us to elaborate a response to the problem between human mortality and the eternity of nature. The bird is capable of transporting Timur's spirit to the afterlife. And it also illustrates the idea of the freedom of spirit from the body. And this is also probably in response to Sa'di's, to a poem in Sa'di's Bustan illustrating the death of Alexander, where the bird represents allegorizes this freedom of the spirit from the body. And in Saadi's case, it is also allegorical in that the freedom of the spirit reaches a certain state of knowledge. And this liberation corresponds to the freedom of nature, a freedom that results from being created from divine language. And again, Hatifi creates a textual assemblage by using poetic language to depict the navigation between one world and the next, which showcases the power of poetry to transcend the boundaries between both of these worlds through the figure of Timur. And so in the case of, now we're moving to the next one, Christopher Marlowe's play. Christopher Marlowe's play, it invites his audience to think about the relationship between rhetoric and power from the very beginning, as it's seen here. This is the prologue. We also see this in connection to the construction of the world and the cosmos. This work, much like Hatifi's, comments on the power of poetic language, and it is framed as such from the very beginning with high outstanding terms. So Tamerlane employs rhetoric and poetic language in order to create a perception of unlimited cosmic and earthly power. From the very first scene, we see the idea of astronomical determinism being involved. And many critics, such as Tom Reuter, have called our attention to Marlowe's engagements with science, and particularly weather, in the context of grappling with larger theological questions, such as divine providence, the political uses of religion, and the nature of God. And so Marlowe's Tamerlane grapples with the relationship between astrology, politics, and language. And so the next slide shows us the astrological chart. Tamerlane talking about his own astrological chart, saying that he is ruled by establishing an association with Jove or Jupiter. Through his practices of reading and uses of rhetoric, reading as something that allows him to experience the world, Tamerlane can manipulate the universe at will. In this very line, Tamerlane foreshadows his attempt to defy divine order, something which reaches peak tension in the second part of the play. In this scene where we see the conjunction of cosmic forces and political discourse, we see this by way of rhetorical arguments. By way of rhetoric, we can see the increasing tension between Tamerlane and the cosmic forces, represented in a description of a divine machinery based on Greek mythology and astrology. In scene 7 of Act 2, Tamerlane reveals the means through which he aims to take over the Persian throne. And so this is going to be the next slide. This section of the play reveals Tamerlane's ambition to claim mighty Jove as both suitable precedent for him and his aspirations. As Beringer puts it, he seeks to interject the very power with which he can displace prior models and assert himself totally, subsuming all values onto himself. These values place Tamerlane as a godlike figure, and a figure that wants to defy divine powers and to place himself in the empyrean heaven. This is paradox. This is also paradox with the last line of this speech, which is that perfect bliss of soul felicity, which is the sweet fruition of an earthly crown, On the one hand, Tamerlane attempts to gain infinite knowledge of the cosmos through a materialist quest for earthly power. And so this is done through endless cycles of strife throughout the play. As he says, warring our beasts for regiment. That knowledge of the material world is available. In this materialism, it is this materialism that creates a Tamerlane that attempts to chart a new map of the world. And so this is going to be the next slide. The map traced by Tamerlane is one that goes beyond the limits of classical geography and is beyond representation. And the reason for this is that it's sort of an infinite, ever-expanding map. And it is a text that, and so again, this is where Ortelius sort of comes in, because there is this sort of expansion of the cartographic knowledge of the world that is also represented within the play as a kind of infinite search for knowledge. And so it showcases another paradox in the play, which attempts to depict and showcase a world, but it is also unable to do so because it is infinite. Well, the play is sort of finite, so it relies on a kind of continuous cyclical structure. And so this leads us to the highest point of this tension, which is a scene that showcases the burning of the Quran, and this is the next slide. Now, granted, one of the things that is in question is whether the Quran was actually burned, because there's Michael Archer actually argues that it's probably, even though it was claimed that it would be burned, there weren't Qurans weren't perhaps as widely available to be burnt, and this play was sort of reproduced again and again and again. And so Tamerlane presents us with a challenge of both interpretation and representation. Through the burning of a religious text, on the one hand, Tamerlane refers to the text on the previous line as a superstitious book and qualifies God as having qualities similar to those of himself. But here, Tamerlane also identifies himself as the scourge of God. And the scourge of God is only possible within the depiction of a disaster of cosmic proportions. And inside the play's inner logic, this subverts expectations of divine providence and cosmic order. The God whose image, according to Beringer, the God whose image he compares to his own is always a God of war, a God whose punishing, rejecting left hand wields a tyrannous and bloody power that concedes no redemption. And yet, Tamerlane insists on the lack of ability to represent God, because Tamerlane, as Tamerlane says, the God that sits in heaven, if any God, for he is God alone and not but he, suggesting the ability of play, poetry, and rhetoric to represent God. And they sort of extend this logic to religious texts. And so this is sort of taken up until Tamerlane's death at the end of the play, where he dies from illness, and he dies in a carriage that continues going even after he died. And so depicted here is Tamerlane's perception that the cosmic and natural forces have conspired against him. he attempts to rebel until the very end against a daring god, as well as a natural illness that caused his death. His illness had become a humiliating return to being a man. A battle against both cosmic and earthly forces has concluded in this result. It is worth noting that on his deathbed, his deathbed is a chariot, as I said, that never stops after his death. The play's ending performs a denial of those moral convictions which normally attend to one's poetic justice. In all of these cases, Tamberlane, through his rise to godlikeness and his employment of warfare, conquest, and maps to challenge the ability to represent, is a play that comments on the relationship between rhetoric and nature. And it is through a triangulation of the depiction of the historical figure of Tamberlane, the assemblage of a material of a world in a play, and the mediation of these elements through language, that the play is able to create a convincing plot. However, Tamberlane's deification is never fully realized and ultimately ends in his downfall. And so the conclusion is, this paper, for a short conclusion, this paper has, through a parallel reading of two texts that attest to the literary afterlives of Tamberlane, has attempted to read how these texts engage in a rhetoric that is capable of placing Tamberlane between the worlds of the earthly and the divine. And this exercise has been done through exercises of rhetoric that involve assemblage, which I borrow from Jane Michelson, who defines it as an open framework in which readers experience, recontextualize, and experiment with many worlds: God's divine realm, the created phenomenal world, man-made worlds, and worlds of the imagination. And this experimentation is therefore suggestive of a theory of language at work and of poetics in both of these literary projects, that consists on using the ontological status of the word as divine message and earthly language to either represent or subvert the representation of nature, history, and death. In that sense, both of these projects address the possibility of representing them as part of literature and poetry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. We have a few minutes left for general discussion.
I'd like to kick off a question. Is I know that paper is not really a historical paper; it's like a literary analysis. But I'm curious, so what? Because it is they both talking about, and so like Christopher had no contact with Persian epic talking about, right? You don't think
No.
And Marlowe obviously never read Persian or Arabic or any of those languages.
Exactly.
But I mean, the similarity between these uses of astrological symbols, is very interesting. And also, I remember reading, Marlowe's Tamerlane back, a couple years ago, and I just thought, it's so interesting that even in the 15th century, Marlowe seems to think that Muslims worship ancient Greek gods.
Right.
And so I'm just curious, what were the sources that Marlowe, you think, was drawing on for Tamerlane, or was he just spinning out of his imagination full cloth, or was he drawing on any kind of previously literary or historical sources to try to construct his narrative?
There were plenty of historical sources that may have been available to him. By historical, I mean, one of them is this Silva de Varia Lección, which is a kind of a compendium of different things that includes anything from medical advice until a chapter on the Turks. It's kind of like a big encyclopedia. And so that was translated into French and then into English. And there's also And of course, Ortelius, the Ortelius reference as well is quite evident. And I think there was another work that is in Latin, because you could read that. And I know that it was sort of put out as a kind of biography of Timur. It's called the Vita. And it was published in Italy initially, but Marlowe had access to that as well as other Italian works, because we know he studied them.
He was a university
in Cambridge. So he had access to those.
I wonder though about how much it's ascribing the worship of Greek gods to the Muslims as it is 15th and 16th century European fascination with Greek mythology and the appropriation of Greek mythology into a cultural milieu in Europe.
I mean, it's interesting that I mean, like, I'm not sure. I guess I know that the top of Eduardo's paper, like Tamerlane's intention, and other than Marlowe's, intent. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if Marlowe was intending, because obviously, if you read very old European texts about Islam, you're the Song of Roland, and the Muslims are described as worshiping an unholy trinity of Apollo and Satan and Muhammad.
Mhm.
And then later on, when you get Dante's Inferno and stories like that, well, the story is Muhammad was a renegade cardinal who was going to become pope, but his papal ambitions were thwarted, so he just started his own religion out of spite. But nonetheless, that kind of later Middle Ages, you get as progression, people start acknowledging, okay, Muslims believe in Jesus and Abraham and Moses and follow one God, and that's why they're following a heretical schismatic. And of course, in the Renaissance era Enlightenment, you start to have more of an accurate portrayal, and so it seems like Christopher Marlowe portraying Muslims worshiping Greek gods. He's kind of trapped in like the ninth century. But I mean, I don't know if he even cared or if he was just using that for a convenient plot device, because he did, idolize. Yeah, they had a fascination with Greek mythology. So who knows if Marlowe? I guess who knows? The only one person who can ask is Marlowe, and he's dead. Unless he's a vampire, some people say he is. Maybe he's still alive. But
Yeah.
The standards of historic history were not very high back then, I suppose.
There was I think part of the thing that he's doing is maybe he's putting this in conversation with the epic tradition, because and with Ovid, because a lot of what many people were doing even at this time in the 16th century and before the 15th century, both in England and Italy and in many other places, was creating works that were epic poems of people from the present or from the relatively recent past, and putting this whole Greek mythological machinery around it. I know that's what happens, for example, with the Luciots. And people find it very odd, because on the one hand, it's supposed to be a work of celebrating Catholicism and Catholic conquest. On the other hand, you have this sort of gigantic machinery of mythical characters from the Greek and Roman tradition.
Are you guys done with that part?
yeah, I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, that's just a good question. So out of curiosity, because it is interesting, like I guess kind of piggybacking off of what he said, or to continue with that. I mean, Tamerlane's conquests were pretty much in Asia. It wasn't so much Europe. So it is interesting that some Europeans or Westerners kind of had some interest in this figure. And I was curious, like, so when they're kind of depicting him in these plays or in this poetic writings or even historical accounts, do they see him as more of a great figure, like someone to be admired, or is it more depicted in a negative fashion. There's, because oftentimes we have like this negative bias depending on the figure. And I didn't know if you noticed a trend among that in terms of your readings of artistic works.
So I think a lot of it has, in the case of Marlowe especially, well, I think Europeans, many Europeans had a sense of ambivalence towards Tamerlane. On the one hand, the Timurid Empire had become an important geopolitical player because they thought that if they established alliances with the Timurid Empire, they would be able to defeat the Ottomans. That was actually the motivation of one Ruy González de Clavijo, who moved from, who did an embassy from Spain all the way to Samarkand to meet Timur. And you know, even if you read that, there is a fascination with certain aspects of the material layout of the city of Samarkand. Like there is a fascination with the beauty of the buildings, the collections, even the layout of the imperial court. We see that also with Tamerlane, I think. He is not by any means, I don't think Marlowe was trying to create any sort of moral example out of him or any of his characters for that matter. But there is some suspicion that he was also illustrating other ideas, such as Tamerlane as being a sort of Machiavellian prince. And that is shown because we know that Marlowe had access to Machiavelli. And much of the materialist and realistic, I don't want to say realistic necessarily, but the materialist politics that go into that go in the structure of the narrative of the play can be considered sort of plays on Machiavelli.
So they're a little more ambivalent. Whereas, and I just say this because even within the Muslim world, you'll have two depictions of him. You have one depiction where he's like this mass murderer, you know, who would kill at all costs. And then the other side, you have these fantastic stories of how upright he was, how like he would fight on battlefields, both-handed, and you know, phenomenal scholar in every way and upright person. So it's just like kind of you have two very, you know, polarized views of it. So I was curious to know how the Europeans and the Westerners kind of viewed it, especially because it's kind of separated from the geographically.
Yeah. So I think, there was a mixture of fascination
or aspects.
And also maybe in a sense, like reprehension or I don't know, towards Tamerlane because they knew of his brutality. So there was this. That also reflects this ambivalence.
Were there any other questions online or from anyone here? Let me see if I'm missing anything in the chat.
Well, can I ask how accurate information do we have about Timur? I mean, is there reliable stuff about his life? I mean, I guess given some of the works, it sounds like, especially historically, they weren't using the same standards as modern scholarship. But
my impression is that most scholars, or that many scholars used Shami, or many historians use Shami as the most reliable source, because he was actually, was commissioned by Timur. His work was actually commissioned by Timur himself. And also he was alive during the time of Timur. So that's, I think, generally seen as one of the more reliable sources historically.
And is it preserved what he had written?
Yeah, and there's text editions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it might not be exactly the right way to put it to say that the historical standards were different, rather the historical project was different, right? History as performed in the past is different than history as performed in the present, I guess is how I'd say it. So that different historians in different eras have different projects. So sure, the standards are different, but that's because, not because the important thing is not that the standards are different, but because the project is different, the goal is different, right? So
I guess I'm thinking more from an accuracy perspective.
right, so accuracy, Herodotus is not, in Herodotus, the question isn't about the accuracy, it's about what is the lesson that can be learned from this historical event or this narrative of an historical event. And so if you get the details wrong, it might not matter so much if the point of telling the story is to get a moral lesson, right? So yes, the standards would be different primarily because the project is, or the goal is different.
Now that I think about it, also Yazdi, even though he wrote after Tamerlane's death, many people still use him as a source because he interviewed, or he claims to have interviewed people that were present during Timur's campaigns. Even though his project is, I think, also a theological project, and in many ways, perhaps even a literary project as well.
But even with Shami, for example, if he's alive during his time, there's a tendency to like maybe over-exaggerate positive things if you're kind of working for or beneath this powerful person, right?
Well, yeah.
There's always that aspect of it. No matter how you put it, whether it's time, even if you're closer, you can still have other influences. So
Yeah.
it always brings some question marks, I suppose.
Yeah, there's always questions.
I mean, that's always that's the standard probably any, well, that's probably standard in history even until today, is that if people you admire, you're gonna inflate their, you're gonna say good things about them, not gonna say bad things about them. I mean, in American history today, we have, people who argue about, the success of the New Deal programs, history, the New Deal either being a disaster or a good thing, depending on their ideological agendas.
Yeah.
Or I mean, tying it back to, when I was talking about this al-Kafi, you read, Shiite accounts of history and Sunni accounts of history, and you're not really looking at the same stories whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the standard of Ibn Khaldun. When he said that these are all just rumors.
Yeah.
Well, I heard that something about Timur that he hadn't just memorized the Quran, but he could actually say it word for word in reverse order too off his head. And so I was asking, like, who would memorize it that way? I think he has so many things, like, so these you can tell certain things are embellished, where they're kind of like, it doesn't make any sense,
Yeah. And my guess is that a lot of this is related to maybe broader issues in both of these works. I mean, they both seem to, another commonality that seems to appear is that they both have cyclical narrative structures where you have repetitions of, alliances, fighting, and some kind of performance or speech, and then fighting and stuff like that.
It's like literary styles that kind of look similar. It's kind of like a pattern.
Yeah, so there is a pattern maybe of the allegory of the state as being this cyclical structure where, you know, you have many forces that sort of force or that put Tamerlane in this central position, even forces that are outside of his own charisma and power.
Well, using today's projects and mentality of accuracy, in terms of, from my perspective, is there a book you would say is a good, more accurate depiction, more scholarly based on the standards of the projects of today,
Yeah.
in terms of trying to get a historical account of Timur?
Yeah, you should look into anything written by Beatrice Forbes Mans.
How do you spell the last name?
M-A-N-C. So she wrote, I think the most probably the most historically comprehensive biography of Timur and his conquests, and many other things. There's another article I saw that is publicly available through UNESCO by a scholar whose last name is Ashrafian, and is also a historical reconstruction of Central Asia under Timur. This is,
You said Ashraf.
Ashrafian. Yeah, it's I think on the UNESCO page.
Thank you.
All right, well, we have exceeded our allotment of time, so I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you all for coming today. Thanks especially to Alex and AZADEH and Eduardo. Best of luck in Denver, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.